Now look, Word in Your Ear comes to you at least once a week in the form of a podcast, a video cast, or a thing so new it has no name. And it's free. All we ask is that you subscribe, like, and wherever possible, leave a comment. And if you feel like getting further involved, you can become a Patreon supporter, which could mean you're inviting us to rifle through your record collection, are inviting you to join us for our very special Friday night quiz, and all of us feeling the sum of human happiness has been increased. Details at patreon.com/wordinyourear. And now on with the show.
Dave and I were only talking the other day about films that were made by their soundtracks, films like The Graduate and Trainspotting and Easy Rider. So it's a delight to find that an old pal of the podcast has just written a book pretty much on this subject, actually. It's called Surround Sound, The Stories of Movie Music, by the nation's top flight film expert, Mark Kermode. Very good to see you, Mark.
Very good to see you. Thank you for having me back.
Thanks for joining us.
The last time I was back was when How Does It Feel came out, which was the book that I wrote when I wasn't writing this book, which I was meant to be writing, which is why this book actually arrived 10 years late.
Oh, right. That was the book about your music career.
Yeah, exactly.
It was about the Dodge Brothers and the band and all that.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Because the great truth is writers are always trying to avoid the thing they're supposed to be writing, aren't they? Even if they have to write something else to get out of it.
There was a great phrase that Douglas Adams used to use. He said, "I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they go by."
Absolutely. We know that feeling. Very good to see you. So look, where do we start? I mean, we could start with your first memory of going to see a film. I mean, what's the first film we ever saw? Can you remember?
The first film I remember seeing was Krakatoa East of Java, which my mum took me to see.
Yeah.
And I just remember sitting in the cinema and it was like volcanoes and airships. And I just remember thinking, I just don't want to go home. I want to stay here. And then the first soundtrack album that I remember, and this is really clear, my mum took me to see Dougal and the Blue Cat. And I know I go on about this a lot, but it's like everyone's got their kind of, their seminal moment. So I went to see Dougal and the Blue Cat, and I loved it. It was the feature film of the Magic Roundabout. But it's a really interesting film. I mean, it's mad. It looks like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it's Eric Thompson, and then Fenella Fielding is the sinister blue voice, and a whole part of it takes place in a deserted glue factory, and it's so weird. And I loved the film. And then we were in Woolworths, and they had a soundtrack album of Dougal and the Blue Cat in Woolworths. It was like an MFP. Remember Music for Pleasure?
Yes.
They were 99p back then. And I said, "Oh, Mum, can we get the album?" She went, "No, it's 99p. I went, "Yeah, I know, but and I was a very insistent kid." And so she bought it, and we took the album home, and my dad let me play it on, well, he played it on his record player because he had a gramophone, had a lot of stuff in it. And when you played the Dougal and the Blue Cat soundtrack, it was the whole film. It wasn't just the music, it was the whole film. So you put the needle on the, side one, and it starts, and the Eric Thompson narration starts, and it's got
brilliant.
The songs and everything, the whole thing. And I remember, because this is in the days way before video, because those of us of a certain vintage, of which I know, gentlemen, we're all in the same club, we all remember when, if you saw a film and you wanted to see it again, you either had to wait for it to come back to the cinema, or maybe it would be on television. But video seemed like that was something you had in Star Trek.
Absolutely.
So I played the record and I imagined the film in my head. And then I never actually had a video of Dougal and the Blue Cat for years and years, but I had a version of it that played in my head because of that soundtrack album. But the problem was that it convinced me that soundtrack albums were the whole thing. And then
with dialogue. Yeah.
And then I remember going to, there was a record store near where I used to live in Finchley called Loppy Lugs Records. And they had an LP of The Sting, the 1973 film with Robert Redford. Yeah, exactly. So it was all those Scott Joplin tracks, which had been sort of rearranged by Marvin Hamlish. And I asked them to play a bit of it because I wanted to hear and they played one of the tunes. And then the guy went to this is at the time that you could go into a record store and ask them to play a track and they wouldn't just throw you out. And he played one of the tunes, and then when the tune finished, he went to pick the needle off, and I went, no, leave it. And he went, "Why? Do you want to hear another one?" I went, "No, I want to hear the words."
Want to hear them talking?
And he looked at me and he went, There are no words.
Security.
It's instrumental. Yes, exactly. And I went, no. Where's the words of the movie? Where's the words of the movie? And he looked at me, and I had this impression is so deeply embedded in my head. I write about this in the book. He had a Yes T-shirt on.
Yes, it's very funny.
And he went, there are no words. It's just the music. And I kind of shrank down like this. And then as I was leaving the store, I remember thinking, well, maybe that's enough. And that was when I actually started thinking that movie soundtrack music might be enough. But it was such a shock.
We should just establish historically, because you talk about it in the book, it's really interesting, I think, is that before sound, which I think was probably Al Jolson's jazz singer or whatever, it's debatable, but before that, there was no sound. And yet movie theatres were quite noisy places, weren't they? Because there were people playing, right?
I mean, it's interesting because we did a chapter on this in the book. And the book I've co-written with Jenny Nelson, who was my producer at Scala Radio, because I needed a collaborator because the subject was too big. But Neil Brand, who you probably know from Sound of Cinema, these amazing TV programs that he does, and Neil, he's the country's leading silent film pianist, but he also writes, scores but he's really interested in researching what you actually heard in a cinema in the days before sound. And the whole thing is silent cinema was never silent. From the first days that they were projecting moving images in a cafe in Paris, people were playing something to it. And what's really fascinating is that Neil discovered that idea of it being just a lone pianist actually isn't very accurate, because in the return of the century, the time when moving pictures really started, I mean, originally they're playing in music hall venues. People had pianos in their front room. People played their own music at home. So you needed something else. So you kind of needed maybe a cello or a violin or something. And Neil said this thing. He said, they would get pickup bands, like just local bands. They just say, just play something sad, and then play something exciting, and then play something, melancholic. And that was how the band I was in, the Dodge Brothers, ended up accompanying silent movies, because Neil said, I'd like to do that to see whether it's possible to do it now. And we said, what are we going to do? The whole band is going to improvise. It's going to be horrible. And he went, no, it'll be great. He said, you watch the screen for the mood of the film, you watch my left hand for the key, and you'll be fine. And we've been doing that for, over a decade now. And it has worked. But the reason it's worked is because Neil is a genius. And watching Neil play along to a silent film is kind of a real lesson in how movie music works, because he does that thing. He literally looks at the screen and he's just got his hands on the keys and he plays the mood of the film. And it's amazing. The key thing, you're absolutely right. Silent cinema was never silent. It didn't happen. People always put accompaniment on it.
So when an action sequence comes up, you've got to just abruptly change gear, and you all do that.
Yeah. That's exactly. In fact, there was.
But you're not playing a song, are you? You're just playing a track,
presumably,
in a certain key.
Yeah. What we would do, like for example, there's a film called Beggars of Life, a Louise Brooks film, which we've played quite a lot now, and we like it. So we know the structure of the film, and there are a few music cues, bits of songs. Like, for example, there was a theme song written for Beggars of Life, this kind of melancholy tune. And you learn that, and then there may be a point in the drama when it seems good to fall into that. But you don't know what key you're going to fall into it in, and you don't know what arrangement of it you're going to fall into. I mean, it's funny, I was watching a film just yesterday, and they use a long section of Brick in the Wall, not the single version, the earlier bit of Brick in the Wall on the Floyd album, because I'd forgotten that, of course, that tune comes round several times during the course of the album, but it comes round in different formats. And it's kind of like that. You may have themes that you think you will return to, but how you will return to them is anybody's guess. Or in our case, it's Neil's guess. I mean, as I said, Neil follows the film and we follow Neil.
Right. But music has always been just part of what people expected cinema to be.
Yeah. Yes.
And that in the kind of, when Sinatra and people like that, performed, they would be performing alongside films, wouldn't they? You get cinemas in New York where they'd show the movie and then there'd be a band in between. Then they showed the movie again, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, look, there may still be some people old enough to remember the kind of variety roadshow thing in which, you'd get a magician and then you get a quiz and then you get a short film and then, that whole kind of what we now think of as kind of roadshow. And of course, in the days before bespoke cinemas, film was basically being projected in the auditorium of music hall. So the two things were absolutely, I mean, even kind of, in the fairly recent past, people will have been to maybe a cinema in the West End where there's the thing with the Wurlitzer organ coming up through the floor. That's theatre, isn't it? That's a bit of theatre. I mean, I remember going to sort of Saturday morning cinema club and there would literally be a magician and then there'd be somebody doing, a raffle, and then you'd get a Children's Film Foundation movie or something. It was happening even then.
Yeah. So, give us an idea of the shape of your book, and what it takes in, what you've sought to do.
Well, what we tried to do, as I said, the book is 10 years late. And the reason it wasn't just laziness on my part. It was because every time I tried to approach the subject, it was just too big. And look, you're all writers, you understand this. Sometimes if you're really close to something and it's really big, you can't do it.
No, absolutely.
It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
Yeah, you have to have a format, don't you?
You have to have a format, and you also sometimes you need a collaborator. And I've been doing the Scala show with Jenny we did it for 5 years. And every week we would write the show together. If anybody who's worked in radio knows that if you hear a radio presenter talking, you're not just hearing them talking. You're hearing them and their producer talking through them, because radio shows are obviously in an ideal world they're produced like that. So Jenny and I had a very good working relationship, and Linda, my wife, said, this book that you're not writing? And I went, yeah. And she went, why don't you just ask Jenny to write it? Because you're writing a 2-hour show with her every week and you never complain about that. And it was like this light bulb moment. And I went to Jenny and I said, I don't suppose you want to write this book with me? And she said, I've been waiting for you to ask me to write this book with you for the last 5 years. But I thought, and of course, what happened was we were then able to sit down. And I'd done a bunch of research. I'd done a bunch of interviews. I'd done scraps of chapters. Again, you're writers, you know how this is. You've got a bit over here and you got a bit over here. And I said to Jenny, look, I've got all these things. And she said, okay, now what you need is we need structure. What are we doing? Are you doing historical? How are you doing it? And what we agreed pretty fast was that we wanted to do two things. The first thing was that we wanted to do a series of interviews with composers and people working in sound recording at places like Abbey Road. Like, how does a score actually get written? How does it get arranged? How does it get recorded? And then how sometimes does it get dumped from the movie? And we did about 45 interviews with composers, and it was great. We had very good access. So, whether it's, Johnny Greenwood or Howard Shaw or Anna Meredith or Rachel Portman or, or Anne Dudley or Hilda Gudnadottir, because we'd done the radio show, we had kind of made contact with a lot of these people. So we did a series of interviews with them, and I think we divided them about half and half. I remember at one point we couldn't actually remember who had interviewed who, and we had to go back to the original recordings because we were just reading the transcripts and going, was that you or was that me? So we did that so that whatever else the book might be, it was at least a coalface account of what it's like to make a score and the different ways it can be done. So, Howard Shaw always starts with a pencil on paper. Anna Meredith comes out of a classical background. She uses classical composition, which she then, transfers into the electronic thing. And we did a lot of stuff about how electronica has changed things, how it's now possible for Anna Meredith or Blank Mass or something like that to record a score pretty much in their front room, and they need to decide. Brilliant British composer to do that. And then we interviewed people at recording studios, and we did a lot of work at Abbey Road. What actually happens when you get into the room and you've got a 60-piece, 70-piece orchestra, and the director is in there and they are changing their mind as you are recording the score, And
talk about this, because my only experience of this, when I was writing my book about Abbey Road, I got to spend, a few hours in Studio One when they were recording the score for a movie. I can't even remember the name of it, where Idris Elba plays somebody fighting a lion. You must have seen this thing. And I spent 2 hours in this place with these people taking immense pains over doing this, and they had producers down the line in Hollywood viewing this thing, and the film came out, and as far as I could see, disappeared without trace.
Yeah,
and I thought, is this amount of work going on all the time?
But David, yes, and okay, this is the astonishing thing. I mean, look, I'm a film critic, right? And we've all done that thing about going, this film's just rubbish, just ignore it. And you are, by doing that, dismissing the work of, I mean, if anybody's ever sat through the credits of a movie, hundreds and hundreds of people. But also, that whole process became critically changed when electronic recording, electronic editing, digital recording enabled changes to be made to a film, digital editing, way into the process. So there's a story when they were doing the Lord of the Rings score, and Peter Jackson was on the other side of the world editing scenes, and they were here recording the score, and they'd record the score and send it by the then quite cronky ether, and they'd send it, and by the time it got to the other side of the world, he'd re-edited the scene, and they were having to come back and change all the cues. And in the end, they just had to say, no, stop. We have to have a cutoff point, because it used to be the case, if you were cutting film physically on film, there was a point when it was pretty much locked. You can't just endlessly go back and change things. But nowadays, with digital editing, you can. And okay, fine. On the one hand, it's made things malleable, and that's brilliant. But on the other hand, it has also meant that people can edit movies right up until the day before they're released. And if you're working in composition and sound recording, that is a complete nightmare, because you're trying to write cues that fit to picture. And if the picture keeps changing, that doesn't happen. So, it was fascinating. Isn't Abbey Road an amazing place?
It's extraordinary. And what I couldn't get away with, but you'll know far more about this than I do, is every single cue is written. So just when somebody comes in the door and there's 3 chords played, that's written down. Somebody has labored over that.
Yeah.
And there'll be hundreds of those in the course of a movie.
And, one of the other interesting things, so we interviewed some musicians as well, like Maxine Kwok, who's a lead violinist, and they were saying things that the thing that's really remarkable, and this is particular to the UK and to London in particular, our orchestras are very, very good at sight reading. And this is the reason, in America with the studio system, it's kind of slightly different. They had a slightly different rhythm. But one of the reasons why it's almost impossible to book into a London studio now to do this, because everybody wants them, because literally you put the music in front of them and they play it. And Maxine Kwok said this thing. She said, you get in, you get about 3 minutes and you look through the score to see whether you've got any solos, and then you go. And so there's this really remarkable thing that if you've bought a soundtrack album that you listen to over and over again because you love the film and you love the soundtrack album, there is every possibility, if that soundtrack album was recorded in London, you are hearing the only take of it. It was only ever done once, and then if they got it in the back, then they just moved on.
Yeah. I want to ask you this. It strikes me that the huge, the big kind of franchise movies, the Harry Potters, the Star Wars, and so forth. So much of the kind of signature of those films is just the music, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what summons it up for people, isn't it? And it fascinates me that so much of the music is quite traditional. It's an orchestra, isn't it? It's a classical lineup. Tell us about this.
Well, there's an interesting thing here, which is, so one of the things we were trying to do with the book as well was to say, look, the kind of history of film music it's not just a bunch of old white men, which is, there's a huge amount of women composers working. They have been working for ages and ages. Their histories have often been kind of overlooked. But when you get to the sort of the John Williamses, okay, the Jerry. I'm a huge Jerry Goldsmith fan, but John Williams is probably, you could argue, the most successful film composer, not just of today, but of all time, probably.
Yeah, who worked with Hitchcock, didn't he, early on?
John Williams started out playing in studio orchestras. So that was how. So he didn't start as a composer. He started working in studio orchestras. So he was a session musician. But the fascinating thing is, I was talking to Edgar Wright a couple of years ago, and we were talking about which soundtracks kind of defined who you were. And Edgar said this really interesting thing. He said, I think John Williams may be the last whistle test composer. And what he meant was the last composer who wrote themes that you know, the whole whistle test thing is if the guy was whistling on the way, exactly, that you could literally go, it's what you just said, David, dun, 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 you know what that is, dun, dun, you know what that is, da, 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 you know what that, even with me singing it badly, you know what it is. One of the things
it's a shark or it's a spaceship or it's whatever, you get it straight away, don't you? Yeah.
But it is true that that is not as... You know, back in the days of, you know, Corn Gold and Cider and everything, those kind of themes, they were the order of the day. And of course, John Williams is firmly rooted in that tradition. Nowadays, however, there is a very different palette. And the point that Edgar was making was, you know, the last hummable composer. And, you know, obviously these things, they're like pendulums, they swing backwards and forwards. But, you know, if I said to you, okay, sing me the Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross theme from such that, you'd have to think about it. Even if you knew it really well, you'd have to think about it before you did it.
Whereas the good, the bad, and the ugly or something, you just got those things in your head, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I don't know that that's a change for the worse. I mean, the great example of this is Forbidden Planet, which is like an amazing science fiction film, for which the soundtrack for it was done by Bibi and Louis Barron. And their soundtrack, which it's music, but Life Jim, but not as we know it. What they did was they produced electronic noise, and they had this whole theory about, because the planet that Forbidden Planet is taking place on is it's like a dying planet. And they did this thing about overloading circuits and then recording the sounds that the diodes made as they died. And B.B. Barron did this brilliant sort of description of it. It's like a kind of this momentary orgasm in a vacuum followed by this kind of thing. Anyway, when they did the soundtrack to that film, and they did it all outside of the studio got them on because they wanted them to do it. When the soundtrack was finished, they weren't allowed to be credited as writing music because the Musicians Union didn't think that what they'd done was music. So on that film, they are credited as electronic tonalities by. And then you think you move forward just a few decades and you've got Blade Runner and you've got a whole bunch of things that we're now very used to, electronica scores. But really, that starts with Bibi and Louis Barron sitting in their shed blowing up circuits, recording the sounds that they make, and then having a fight with the Musicians Union who say, well, that's not music, that's just circuitry.
There's the book, I mean, it's broadly, in terms of areas, there's the orchestral music, which we've been talking about, soundtrack music, and there's also a kind of different area where it's the use of a song.
Yeah, pop music.
Dave and I were talking about this the other day, and it really struck me as fascinating that maybe the first really good example might have been the Graduate, actually, but the one that really struck me was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because Bacharach and David wrote a song for that, which is effectively a video dropped into a pop video.
Yeah.
And I just looked it up this afternoon to see how well that record did. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. Massive number one all over the world. So in terms of the marketing of that movie, that was a major change, wasn't it?
Yes, and you know, if you think... So I'm 62, 63, however old I am. I was born anyway, I'm 60-something. I remember really clearly in the 80s when suddenly there was this thing on Top of the Pops, which was that you'd have a hit song, but it wasn't, the video was basically just an advert for a film. So An Officer and a Gentleman was Love Lift Us Up Where We Belong. Back to the Future, you know, the song was just like a little bit of the band and then this promo for the film. And so that whole idea about having a hit song, you know, a playable tune to tie in with a movie to make it kind of work, it has a long history, and it goes back exactly as you've just said. However, I had always been of the opinion that the sort of starting point of the pop music and the movies thing is Blackboard Jungle, because Blackboard Jungle famously uses Rock Around the Clock, and Rock Around the Clock had been out before. It was a B-side. It wasn't very successful. And then it ends up at the beginning of Blackboard Jungle. Blackboard Jungle becomes a huge sensation because it's a very controversial film. People go along to see it because they want to hear this song played on big cinema speakers. And the next thing is Rock Around the Clock is this huge hit. So there's this completely symbiotic relationship. But even way before that, at the very beginning of sound film, you're effectively getting proto-pop videos, like there are films like St. Louis Blues, which is a 17-minute kind of dramatization of that song. And that happens like literally right at the very beginning of sound. So these sound shorts very, very early on. There's a book which you're probably aware of. It's edited by Marshall Crenshaw, and it's called Hollywood Rock, and it's about the relationship between pop music and the movies. And there's a brilliant entry on Blackboard Jungle in which the entry says, you can just see all the studio executives watching Blackboard Jungle, jumping out of their seats and going, yes, do that. But the really interesting thing is it had been going on for a long time beforehand. It's just that's what we think of as the kind of starting point, because it was this big kind of kickstart as far as rock and roll is concerned. That chapter that you're talking about, that chapter about pop music and movies, was the absolute. That was like wrestling an octopus. And when I first started working with Jenny, that was one of the things that I'd been trying to nail for a long time, because it's like you start pulling at threads and you find out there's so much ground. And in the end, and relating back to an earlier question you said in terms of, what's the book doing? There is also a kind of a version of a film music history, but it is a version of it, because the actual history of film music is so big, so complicated, and also so canonical nowadays that we were trying to do something slightly different, which is, look, here are some composers that you may not have heard of. Here are some composers who perhaps didn't get the credit that the big well-known names get. But as I said, doing that pop music and movies chapter, that was the thing that nearly floored me. And that was the thing that originally kind of really, really stopped the book getting written, because it just kept expanding. Again, you're writers, you know how this is. Somebody says, write me 3,000 words on a subject you love, and then you go, well, I've got 10,000 words. Is that any good?
We were wondering if Easy Rider kind of invented the idea of the pop video, in fact, because that's where you just take a piece of music and then just shoot some footage to go with it, which is two blokes flying down the highway on massive motorbikes. I mean, maybe. Yeah,
it doesn't. The pop video starts way before that. The reason Easy Rider is kind of as significant as it is because that soundtrack is an iconic, alternative culture soundtrack, wedded to a movie that cost very little money, that took a huge amount of money, and then again kind of got the studios to wake up to realizing, oh, hang on, there is a formula here that we can work with. So pretty soon after Easy Rider, around the same time as well, you start to get these sort of independent, alternative, what we think of as the new Hollywood. The Easy Rider's Raging Bulls, which goes from Easy Rider and then on through the whole explosion of new Hollywood. And a lot of that is tied in with, let's get Pink Floyd on the soundtrack, let's get Can on the soundtrack, let's get, and it is really interesting now that if you say, this relates to the John Williams thing. If you go to somebody, what do you see in your mind if I go, and what they see is two blokes on big motorbike. That's what they see. And because exactly that thing that you just said, that image is so wedded to that piece of music.
Yeah. But also post those movies and, post Scorsese and so forth. We were talking about this on the podcast the other day. Scorsese writing the script for Goodfellas goes, Clapton, write it in, And he's talking about not a sound, he's talking about a specific record.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about Edgar Wright and loads of movie makers nowadays, they are music fans. They're record fans, aren't they?
Yeah.
And these are people, if you give them an opportunity to have 5 minutes of the film devoted to a piece of music, they will do it, won't they? Because they want to.
Yes, and I mean, Edgar Wright is interesting because Edgar is so musically literate. I mean, if you watch Baby Driver, you just go, okay, I mean, that
has Egyptian reggae in the middle of it. It has Martha and the Vandellas, Nowhere to Run, doesn't it? It's amazing.
Yeah, and John Spencer Blues Explosion doing the car chase, which is just a magnificent thing.
Yeah.
But the kind of, the sort of uber text of all of this, I mean, Scorsese is working with pop music from very, very early on. And funnily enough, the BFI did a book that I had contributed to. They did it in 1995 called Celluloid Jukebox. And Martin Scorsese wrote the introduction to it, the foreword to it. And he said, pop music has always been part of my life. And consequently, it is the soundtrack of my life and therefore the soundtrack of my movies. But the kind of uber text for this is American Graffiti. Yeah. Because famously, when George Lucas was doing American Graffiti, he did exactly that thing that you're saying. He wrote the script with the records playing underneath, because I interviewed Walter Murch, who was so much a part of creating the soundtrack of American Graffiti, worldizing the soundtrack, because what they wanted was they wanted the town to sound like a pickle jar, that all that music, everything was marinated in that music, whether it was playing on a jukebox or playing on a car radio, you could just hear it all the time, and then the Wolfman Jack stuff around it. But George Lucas would sit and write the scenes to the records, and apparently when they were turning the film in, the thing everyone said is, it's too much. Take the music out. Take the music out. It's going to drive everyone nuts. Also, it's going to cost a fortune.
Yeah, it cost a fortune.
It's going to cost me to take the music out. And there's an interesting thing, that this interview with Walter, in which Walter talks about what they did, was that they made the sort of the backdrop radio show that's kind of playing all the way through American Graffiti. And then this system that he came up with, which he called worldizing, in which he and George Lucas went out into the backyard, and George Lucas had a speaker and Walter Murch had a microphone, and they stood about 15 feet away from each other, and then they would play the soundtrack on the speaker, and then at like 5-10 second intervals they would turn like 90 degrees away, to kind of create this diffusion, so there was a sound as if you were hearing it on the street. And then what they did was they took that worldized sound, and then he ran that in sync with the whole track that they had. And it meant that there's huge sections of American Graffiti in which there is music, but it's in the background. It sounds like it's part of the world. It doesn't sound like it's laid on top, it's so smart. And I know, heaven knows, because I've done it myself, it's very easy to be rude about George Lucas's filmmaking. But the fact is, American Graffiti is an astonishing piece of music editing. I mean, that is a film made by somebody who knows that music inside out and knows exactly what they want, when they want it, and why they want it.
It must be such a thrill to be able to do that. I was watching Jerry Maguire the other day, and Cameron Crowe does it all the time. There's a little tiny action sequence there with Tom Cruise where he uses just the introduction before the vocal of "Oh Well" by Fleetwood Mac. It's just a really extraordinarily elaborate, instrumental. And he'd probably heard that and just thought, I'll put that on one side, and one day I will edit a piece of film that's whatever it is, 1 minute 20 seconds.
But that only happens when you've got a generation of filmmakers who've grown up with a head full of records. Alfred Hitchcock would never have done it like that.
That's true.
Because he didn't grow up with a head full of records. Might have grown up with a head full of music, different thing, very different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. It is a defining thing of what we think of as the new Hollywood, the American new wave. I mean, it's funny. I think by the time you get to Tarantino famously using his own record collection with his own scratchy vinyl, it's kind of become something slightly different. It's become very knowing and nod and wink. But I think in its essence, in that period in late 60s, early 70s, when those records are being used, they're not being used ironically. I think that's the thing. There's no irony in them.
No, that's true. So you also, as you say, you've talked to a load of composers, because you've also got people like Johnny Greenwood nowadays, who are kind of rock musicians, we can call them that, who've never been keener on working on films. Is that the case? They like the idea of being able to expand their palette. Is that?
They do. Johnny Greenwood said this really interesting thing. I mean, he's an amazing musician, and I don't know whether you've seen One Battle After Another, but
no,
the score for it is just I mean, it's bananas. It's brilliant. And he sent me this little video, which was a video of there's a piece in it, which is kind of this mad piano and this mad percussion. And the way that he'd managed to do it was by wiring up old analog technology via this kind of Heath Robinson-like thing to yank the piano keys down, and with little triggers on actual acoustic drums. He kind of called it the unnatural offspring of old technology and modern instruments. But the thing that he said, because I was asking him, like, is it different when you're writing for film music or you're writing in a band, or what he always refers to as his popular beat combo? Right. And he said the thing is that when you're working with a director like Paul Thomas Anderson, he said it is like being in a band. The relationship between you and the director and the filmmaker is exactly the same as the relationship with other people in the band. And I thought it was really fascinating, the phrase that you just used about broadening the palette. Obviously, when it comes to writing a film score, there's a lot of space sometimes. And Johnny Greenwood told me this story about when he first saw the assemblies of There Will Be Blood. If you think about the opening of There Will Be Blood, there's a lot of music going on for a long time before any dialogue kicks in. And he said, if you saw the original version, there was more music. He said it was mad. He said Paul Thomas Anderson just left the music on. And I was saying, you've got to take it out because there's just too much music. And he also said that apparently one of the things Paul Thomas Anderson does when he's watching his movies is he just laughs. Apparently he just laughs all the way through because he finds his movies hilarious. And so Johnny Greenwood's got this perfect position in which he's collaborated with a lot of filmmakers, but in the case of Paul Thomas Anderson, he's kind of got this kindred spirit who's giving him the space to do all this. And I said, look, how did you write the score for There Will Be Blood? I mean, it's such a strange score, and the grammar of that film is so peculiar. And he said, I just looked at everything in terms of close-up or wide shot. He said, that's it. That's literally, I wrote all the music in terms of close-up or wide shot. And he said, and as he's gone on, what he's done more and more is to discuss with Paul Thomas Anderson the themes of the film, and then just give him huge swathes of music and go, do that. Now, obviously, it's more specific and collaborative than that. But he was saying, like, in an ideal world, I just write 2 hours of music and just give it to him and go, you figure out where it goes. Because what he's loving, I think, is that, and also he is astonishing. I mean, he should have won an Oscar for There Will Be Blood. It got disqualified because Popcorn Superhit Receiver had been played in part on the BBC. It was just a ludicrous technicality. And honestly, he should win the Oscar this year for One Battle After Another, because it is far and away the most adventurous score you will hear this year. Whether he's even nominated is anybody's guess, because the Oscars are notoriously bad at getting these things right. But that score for One Battle After Another is far and away the most adventurous score you'll hear this year.
So let's finish with this. You started off by saying that I think the first soundtrack record you bought was the one you persuaded your mother to buy.
Dougal and the Blue Cat, yeah.
Dougal and the Blue Cat. And you sat down at home and played it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still do that with records, with the film soundtracks? And which one would you recommend that people sit down and play?
Well, I do still do it because I listen to a lot of film music. Partly, one of the things about film music is a lot of film music obviously is instrumental. It's just the music. And actually, when you're doing other things around the house, sometimes you don't actually want words. You just want instrumental music. And there's this whole philosophy now that film music is the gateway drug to classical music, which is actually a kind of slightly snobby way of saying the truth, is that film music is classical music. It is modern classical. There is an album by Eiko Ishibashi, who's a brilliant Japanese composer, which is the soundtrack to Drive My Car. And Drive My Car got a lot of Oscar attention, but not for the soundtrack. The soundtrack got very, very little attention, but it is a sublime album. And I had got in touch with Eiko Ishibashi when we were doing the Scala show, and I'd just been listening to this soundtrack over and over again. You know, if you get into you've got an album and you just love it and you just literally play it. And now, because we all have portable stuff, now you can get it on your Spotify on your phone. You can walk around the streets listening to it. And so we played a lot of that on the Scala show, which finished, a few years ago now. And still, at least a couple of times a week, I will put that on and listen to it in its entirety because it works as a standalone piece of music. And there is that weird thing that there are some soundtracks that work perfectly with the film, but you can't imagine a circumstance under which you'd sit and listen to them. I mean, I've got a vinyl soundtrack to The Exorcist, right? I can't imagine any circumstance under which I would sit down and listen to that because it is a series of disparate, weird classical music. It's got a bit of Tubular Bells.
A bit of Mike Oldfield.
A bit of Mike Oldfield. And then a whole bunch of atonal squonking, And so I'm never going to listen to that as a coherent soundtrack album. But that Eiko Ishibashi thing, which would drive my car, I mean, it's on Spotify. I mean, I know everybody does everything digitally now. I like to have physical copies of things. That is an album that I would happily put on and listen to from the beginning to the end because it has an arc and a shape and an emotion to it. And there's work by Max Richter. I love Max Richter's stuff, and I think that's superb. But yeah, that Eiko Ishibashi thing is a perfect example of a score that works in and of itself. And actually, I confess I wasn't a huge fan of the film, but I love the score.
Well, there you go. So there's a tip for you. Loads more tips in Mark Kermode's book, Surround Sound, The Stories of Moving Music. Out now? Is it out now?
It is. It's out now. Yes, that's why I'm tarting myself around.
Whoring yourself around.
Very good to talk to you.